Hello, this is or will be shortly, a recording of the very final chapter of a book by Gore Vidal, the American writer, Julian, which is a fictionalized life of the Emperor Julian, who was known to the Christians as Julian the Apostate, because having been raised within a Christian environment, he reverted to the worship of the ancient Hellenic gods of Greece and wanted to re-establish those temples across the empire because under Christianity and the previous Christian emperors, it had already begun to close down temples and sideline pagans in civic life within the Roman Empire. Had he been emperor for a lot longer in his reign, then he probably would have succeeded to some extent, at least, in that. But he met with a sudden end, and that is touched upon by Gore Vidal. I'm not going to reveal the identity of the person who, according to Gore Vidal at least, brought about the emperor's demise, because, spoilers. But it's a fascinating book. It's written in an epistolic style of an exchange of letters and diary entries. So some of it is in the voice of the Emperor Julian himself recording his memoirs, and some of it is a series of letters bouncing back between two elderly philosophers, Priscus and Libanius, who quarrel and bicker and snipe at each other as they reflect on the nature of what Julian wrote. They were both friends of Julian and knew him, and reflect on the nature of what he wrote in his diaries. And it's quite interesting in all sorts of ways, but for example, in terms of how we understand history, that there are things that the emperor is saying, and the two philosophers saying, well, he didn't mention this, or we didn't mention that, or they're disagreeing with his interpretation of events. And of course, so much of history is an understanding of what went on through the eyes of a fairly small number of people. Those who were literate in the first place, which up until quite recently, very few people actually were literate. So the vast majority of the non-literate members of society never got a chance to record their views as to what happened in a given set of events, and so we only ever know about it from a sort of a select point of view, which is interesting in and of itself. But a lot of this is also a reflection, and I think this not only is perhaps true of the life of Julian, but reflects the author's own fascinations, a reflection on what the empire might have become, and of course the wider European Western world might have become had Julian lived longer, had he brought about the reforms he wanted. What kind of a world would we be living in now compared to the reality of what we do live in? And that's something that is striking me quite a lot, having read the novel. Kind of just that sort of what if scenario. There's a lot of well, this isn't really an alternative history in the way that, say, some of the books by Robert Harris deal with alternative histories. What would the world be like had Hitler won the war, etc. This doesn't go down that line. It follows the actual historical series of events, so it culminates with his death. But it leaves open questions that encourage the reader to speculate on the good bits and the bad bits. And whilst I'm a pagan myself, there are certainly, I can perfectly well see that there are things that have been brought about by Christianity which might not, and I say might not because you can never quite tell, obviously, with alternate histories it's all speculation, but might not have come about had Europe remained predominantly pagan. I'm thinking of things like the abolition of slavery. Now, admittedly, it took Christianity 1500 odd years, if not a bit longer, to get to the point where they started to regard slavery as a thing worth ending and getting rid of. So for an enormously long time, the church was quite comfortable for slavery to go on. And there are instances where various church dignitaries were engaging in slave trade and so on. But eventually, of course, the development of individualism, the notion that each soul is worth saving, regardless of whether it's the soul of a free person or the soul of a slave. Everyone has a soul, all souls are worth saving. That, to a large extent, is what brought around the end of slavery. and it contributed eventually, again after a very, very long period of time, to the emancipation of women, the notion that women have souls just the same as men, which sounds like stating the blindingly obvious. But do bear in mind that in certain parts of the world, under different religious regimes, there are still heated debates that go on television and at conferences and things like that, where people, in all seriousness, not done as a kind of an ironic mockery, but in all seriousness, debate whether or not women really have souls to this very day. So it's reflective of the way in which Christianity has eventually, after a period of time, changed the world. Maybe had we stayed with Hellenism or the Roman gods or the Norse gods or whatever, as most people had continued to worship those gods over the course of the last couple of thousand years, possibly those changes might have happened anyway. Maybe they would have happened sooner, maybe they would have happened later, maybe they wouldn't have happened at all. I don't know. It's speculative. But I'd like to read the very last chapter. Chapter 24 is not that long. The exchange of letters and reflections going on between various characters. Because it doesn't spoil anything in the novel, so I'm making a conscious effort not to spoil anything. And I did think about maybe doing an audio recording of the entire book, but as I say, it's quite solid, so it would go on for weeks of things to listen to. It'd be hour upon hour upon hour of listening as well as reading. And I don't yet have the equipment that I'm planning to go and buy to microphones and stuff to help improve the quality of audio recordings. But I'll read this part, and hopefully it will stimulate some thoughts amongst you, people listening to it, and it might inspire some of you, if you haven't already done so, to go out and get a copy of Gore Vidal's book and have a read. And even if you don't want to do that, it might just lead to kind of reflecting on significant changes, how the world might have been, the good things as well as the bad things that have come with Christianity, the good things that we've lost with the end of pagan predominance, as well as perhaps bad things that went on back then that we're glad to see an end of in the modern world. So everything has its good and its bad. And we can't be naive enough to pretend we live in some pantomime where there's complete baddies and complete goodies. There's shades of grey everywhere. So this chapter, the final chapter, opens with a letter. Libanius, Questor of Antioch, to the Lord Theodosius, Augustus of the East. Antioch, May 381. May it please your eternity, I have it in mind to compose a biography of your famous predecessor, the Augustus Julian, employing certain of his private papers which have only recently come into my possession. Since your eternity expressed pleasure in my ode on avenging the Emperor Julian, I need hardly mention that I intend to pursue my labour of vindication in precisely the same discreet style as the ode to which you so graciously admired. Realizing as I do the religious and political implications of this work, I am impelled not only to remind the Augustus of my perfect and obvious loyalty to his sacred person and sagacious policies, but to assure him that I intend to relate this marvellous tale with a conscious delicacy which the subject inspires and the times require. Lord, those of us who cherish the old ways, yet mean to obey to the letter your just and necessary edicts, will be for ever beholden to your magnanimity in allowing me to write with love and candour of a hero whose deeds once blazed upon an astonished and fortunate earth like the sun itself, and whose fame in its day, though as nothing compared to your eternities, was Rome's shield against the barbarian. It is my humble wish to reflect that remembered glory in the pages of my own dim but faithful prose. My cherished friend, the Bishop Meletius, who is now at Constantinople, has told me that he will put my case to your eternity with the same high eloquence with which he has for so many decades enlightened the congregations of the East. Accept then, O Lord, the homage of one who is old and close to death, and wants nothing for himself but truth and its telling. Eutropius, master of the offices, to Libanius, quaestor of Antioch, Constantinople, June 381. The Augustus has read your letter with the interest anything you write deserves. He has commanded me to tell you that it is not possible at this time to publish a life of the late Augustus Julian. You refer to Bishop Meletius. He is dead. He was stricken last week during a session of the Ecumenical Council. His remains have already been sent to Antioch for burial. I am, however, at liberty to tell you that before the bishop died, he asked the Augustus to recognize as legitimate your natural son, Kimon. The Augustus is pleased to comply with this holy man's request. The documents are now being prepared at my office, and will be forwarded in due course to the Count of the East, who will in turn deliver them to the governor of Syria, at which time you will be officially notified. It would not be remiss, Quaestor, were you to send the Augustus a complete edition of your works. He would value them. Libanius to himself. I have just come from the funeral of Bishop Meletius, which was held in the Golden House on the island. I don't think I would have been able to cope with the mob in the square if I had not been with Kimon. It seems that all Antioch was on hand to say farewell to their bishop. The crowds recognized me as they always do, and they made way for my litter. There was a certain amount of good-humoured comment about pagans, a new word of contempt for us Hellenists, attending Christian services, but I pretended not to hear. Just inside the arcade, Kimon lifted me out of the litter. I have been suffering lately from gout, not only in my right foot, as usual, but also in my left. Though I use both a crutch and a staff, I can barely hobble without assistance. Fortunately, Kimon, good son that he is, got me safely inside the church. He was also able to provide me with one of the chairs which had been reserved for the governor's party. The Christians stand during their services, and only great visitors may sit. Of course, I saw nothing. I can distinguish light and dark, but little else. I do have some sight out of the corner of my left eye, and if I hold my head at a certain cocked angle, I can see well enough to read for a short while. But the effort is so great, I prefer to spend my days in the cloudy subaqueous world of the blind. My impression of the church interior was one of pale circles, faces, and dark columns, cloaks of mourning. The air was thick with incense and the inevitable heavy odour of people massed together on a summer day. Prayers were said and eulogies delivered, but I am afraid that I wool gathered during the service. I could think of nothing but that curt letter from the sacred palace. I am not to publish. Not even the legitimizing of Kimon can compensate for that cruel blow. As I sat in the hot octagonal church, the altar to my left and the tall marble pulpit to my right, I was suddenly conscious of the voice of the priest officiating. Like most blind or near blind people, I am acutely sensitive to voices. Some delight me. Others, even those of friends, distress me. This particular voice, I noted with some pleasure, was deep and resonant with that curious urgency which I always find appealing. The speaker was delivering a eulogy of Meletius. I listened attentively. The words were gracefully chosen, the periods artful, the content conventional. When the priest had finished, I turned to Kimon and whispered, "Who is that?" "John Chrysostom, the new deacon appointed last month by Meletius. You know him." "Do I?" But the service had continued, and we kept silent while the new bishop blessed the congregation. Who was this John Goldenmouth? Where did I know him from? Had he been a pupil? And if he had, would I be able to recall him? My memory is not what it was. Also, I have taught literally thousands of men, and no one could remember them all. Finally, when the ceremonies ended, Kimon got me to my feet just as the governor of Syria passed us. I recognized him by the colour of his robe. The governor paused when he saw me.
"Oh, Kestor, how good to see you in such blooming health."
"The governor is an ass, who means well." "The old tree survives," I said, "but it does not bloom." However, he had turned to my son.
"It is not premature. I hope to congratulate you on the Emperor's favour."
Kimon was delighted. He craves honour the way some men crave truth. "No, Governor, not premature at all. Many thanks. My father and I were both delighted at the Emperor's kindness."
"You must give me some advice, Kimon."
And the governor took my son by the arm and led him away, leaving me stranded in the church, blind as Homer and lame as Hephaestus. I confess to a moment of anger. Kimon should have remained with me. He could have made an appointment to see the governor at another time, but Kimon is a lawyer and one must be tolerant. Even so, I found it difficult to forgive him when I realized that I was now alone in the golden house, unable to see and hardly able to walk. Leaning heavily on my stick, like some night creature dazzled by the day, I crept towards what I hoped would be the door. I had taken no more than a step when a firm hand took me by the arm. "Thank you," I said to the vague shape beside me. "I seem to be deserted and I do need help. I cannot see." "Any help I give you is nothing compared to the help you have given me." I recognized the voice of the deacon, John Chrysostom. I pretended to remember him. "Oh, yes, John." "They call me Chrysostom, but you remember me as the son of Anthazar, and—" I did remember him. I knew exactly who he was. "My best student," I exclaimed, "stolen from me by Christians." He laughed. "Not stolen, found." "So, my John is the famous Chrysostom the people listen to." "They listen, but do they understand? After all, I am strange to them. For 10 years I have been in the desert alone." "And now you come back to the world to be a bishop?" "I have come back to the world to preach, to tell the truth, the way my old teacher does." "We hold a different view of what is true," I said more sharply than I intended. "Perhaps not so different." We had paused near the door. With an effort I could just make out the lean face of my old pupil. John had begun to grow bald, and he wears a short beard, but I confess that even were my sight better, I should not have recognized him. It has been nearly 20 years since he started with me. Before he left Antioch, Bishop Meletius told me of your plan to write about the Emperor Julian.
I wondered if John could see into my mind. Why else would he mention the one thing which concerned me, yet could hardly interest him? Unfortunately, it is no longer a plan. The Emperor has forbidden me to publish.
I'm sorry. I know what Julian meant to you. I saw him once. I must have been about 15. It was just before I came to you to study. I saw him the day he left the city for Persia. I was in the crowd in the Forum, standing on the rim of the Nymphaeum when he rode by. I remember the people were shouting something rude.
Felix Julian Augustus, I murmured, hearing again the chanting of that malicious crowd.
Yes, I was so close to him I could have touched his horse, and though my mother had told me I should hate him, I thought he was the most splendid man I ever saw. And when he looked my way, his eyes suddenly caught mine, and he smiled as though we were friends, and I thought to myself, this man is a saint. Why do they hate him? Later, of course, I realized why they hated him, but I have never understood why he hated us.
I burst into tears. I have never been so humiliated or felt so ridiculous. The most famous philosopher of his time, if I may say so, was weeping like a child in front of a former pupil. But John was tactful. He said not a word until the storm had passed, and then made no reference to my senile outburst. He took my arm and led me to the door. Then he turned round and indicated a high place on the opposite wall.
New work, he said. I think it quite beautiful.
I twisted my head so that I could see, just barely, what appeared to be the giant figure of a man with arms outstretched.
Can you see him clearly?
Oh, yes, I lied. The gold mosaic glowed like the sun itself in the afternoon light.
It is Christ Pantocrator, come to redeem us. The face is particularly fine.
Yes, I see the face, I said flatly, and I did. The dark, cruel face of an executioner.
But you don't like what you see.
How can I, when what I see is death?
But death is not the end.
It is the end of life.
This life?
Life! I turned on him fiercely. You have chosen death, all of you.
No, not death. We have chosen eternal life, the resurrection of that.
That is a story to tell children. The truth is that for thousands of years we looked to what was living. Now you look to what is dead. You worship a dead man and tell one another that this world is not for us, while the next is all that matters. Only there is no next world.
We believe.
This is all we have, John Chrysostom. There is nothing else. Turn your back on this world and you face the pit. There was a silence. Then John said,
Do you see no significance in our victory? For we have won, you must admit that.
I shrugged. The golden age is ended. So will the age of iron. So will all things, including man. But with your new God, the hope of human happiness has ended.
Forever? He taunted me gently.
Nothing man invents can last forever, including Christ, his most mischievous invention. John did not answer. We were now outside the church. The day was pleasantly warm. People I could not see greeted me. Then my son hurried up and I said good-bye to John and got into my litter. All the way home to Daphne, Kimon babbled about his interview with the governor. He has hopes of governmental preferment. I am alone in my study. I have already put away Julian's papers. The thing is finished. The world Julian wanted to preserve and restore is gone. But I shall not write forever, for who can know the future? Meanwhile the barbarians are at the gate. Yet when they breach the wall, they will find nothing of value to seize, only empty relics. The spirit of what we were has fled. So be it. I have been reading Plotinus all evening. He has the power to soothe me, and I find his sadness curiously comforting. Even when he writes, "Life here with the things of earth is a sinking, a defeat, a failing of the wing." The wing has indeed failed. One sinks. Defeat is certain. Even as I write these lines, the lamp wick sputters to an end, and the pool of light in which I sit contracts. Soon the room will be dark. One has always feared that death would be like this. But what else is there? With Julian the light went, and now nothing remains but to let the darkness come, and hope for a new sun, and another day, born of time's mystery, and man's love of light.
Rather a sad ending. Well, for some of us, it's not for John Chrysostom. And reflective of so many things, not just in that last chapter, but in the whole book, of the way the world has changed and is continuing to change. What for one person is a great hope and an opportunity and a light, for another is a sadness and a loss and a tragedy. And it's the reconciling of the two that is perhaps the way forward for humanity, as there has been a tendency, just as first parts of this novel touch upon, and you can still see it going on in the world today in various sections, where you either get individual people just ranting and railing against their distant ancestors for being wicked pagans, terrible this, terrible that, terrible the other, or going beyond ranting and railing to, as has been seen in a number of countries in the Middle East, blowing to smithereens the antiquities of the distant past because they're seen as blasphemous and unholy, and making way for a sort of year zero and the new faith and religion, and to some extent, in somewhat less melodramatic, I can't help but thinking this obsession that goes on with rewriting the novels of recent decades to expunge the dodgy bits, the sort of racially dubious or sexist, other types of dubious attitude to be found in the novels of early 20th century or the 19th century or further back than that, to bring those novels up to date and in line with whatever the latest faddy sensibilities are. It's all about expunging the past and purifying it and making it acceptable to the new religion, the new cult, the new way of thinking, rather than just accepting that is what people thought then. Times change, they move on, but that is the way it was. The good, the bad and the ugly must be embraced, rather than purified or obliterated entirely as per these lunatics who blow things to smithereens. I think just as in the lifetime of the Emperor Julian there are all sorts of tumults and transitions and difficulties and clashing cults and alternate rival points of view even within Christianity. It deals with the sort of hatred different bishops had for each other, and they'd turn against each other and sink into sectarianism. And you can see that to this day, not specifically in Christianity, but new ways of thinking emerge, and 5 minutes later they factionalise and they're all at each other's throats, and end up hating each other even more than they hate the people they're replacing that went before them. Will a new dawn arise? Will some kind of new light leading things forward emerge? Obviously for old Libanius that is the hope, and maybe that continues to be a hope, but I suspect if we all just sit on our backsides with our thumbs up various orifices waiting for some specific individual to come and sort it all out for us, we're going to be waiting a bloody long time. I think rather that spark of light has to be within each individual, rather than being one single person who comes and resolves everything. We all have to kind of carry a light forward into the future. This is starting to turn into a sermon, isn't it? It's meant to be just a reflection on a very well written novel. So I think before I get too preachy and have to go and put a tea cosy on my head and start looking like a bishop, I will draw it to a close, and encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to read the book. It's bloody good. And it does pose, like all really good books do, it poses a hell of a lot of questions, far more than it answers, which is a good thing. And it's worth thinking about where we are in this transitional moment in human history, and where we go next. Do we go into the light, or do we descend into a dark age of madness and sectarian vitriol and tear each other to smithereens? Time will tell. Thank you.